Hello, everyone. So as Ellie says, I'm Gemma Nicholas, Senior Associate at VWV, and I have with me Tracy McGee, Director of Quality Care Consultant Services. Thanks again for joining Tracy and I for this session on the CQC's Single Assessment Framework. By way of introduction, I'm a regulatory lawyer dealing with all things CQC, as well as inquests, safeguarding, and judicial review. I worked at the CQC from 2013 to 2019 before moving into private practice. And Tracy has worked in health and social care for over 20 years, working with some of UK's leading providers. Tracy provides independent support and advice to health and social care services on compliance and governance, including mock inspections, action planning, and quality assurance and audits. So I just want to thank Tracy for joining me today. It's great to have you. So I think it's only right in our introduction to note that this webinar factors in recent reports. So namely Dr. Penny Dash's interim report published in July and her final report published last week on the 15th of October into the operational effectiveness of the CQC. And Sir Mike Richards' report, also published on the 15th of October on his review of the single assessment framework. And finally, the CQC's response to these reports. Both Dash and Richards found significant failings within the CQC and serious concerns around the single assessment framework. So this session reflects on changes from the old regime, so pre-single assessment framework, to the new regime under the single assessment framework, as well as recent changes made to the single assessment framework in light of these reports. And also the recommendations made by Dash and Richards of changes for the future. So you may be thinking, why bother explore the single assessment framework in its current form? I mean, it could change next week. Well, that's exactly the reason why. The CQC can still come in and inspect your service, even during this period of limbo. Therefore, you still need to be inspection ready. And that means understanding the current system and keeping track of changes going forward. So let's get started. Next slide, please. So in my presentation, I will look at changes from the old regime to the new regime. So considering quality statements, evidence categories, scoring and rating, what good looks like, and I'll touch upon challenging an assessment. Tracy will present during the second half of the webinar on ways that you can effectively gather feedback, quality assure your systems and processes, how you can create effective pathways of evidence and put in place governance strategies to ensure compliance with the regulations. Next slide, please. So let's consider the overarching changes and how they came about. So that is beginning with the CQC strategy. Next slide, please. Actually, let's go back a bit further. So the CQC was established in 2009, and back then you were either compliant or non-compliant with the standards. Then in 2013, the CQC changed its approach to regulation. So they introduced the 5 key questions that you now know: safe, effective, caring, responsive, and well-led, as well as the ratings that we still use today. Then came the CQC strategy in May 2021, and the strategy set out the CQC's ambitions under 4 strategic themes, and they're listed on the slide there. The single assessment framework is the realisation of its 2021 strategy, and the CQC has reflected on its strategy, calling the new regulatory approach a complex transformation. However, everyone seems to agree that it is in fact an over-ambitious transformation. Next slide, please. The reason this could be seen as an over-ambitious transformation is the CQC made changes in all 3 of these areas at the same time. So introducing the provider portal, making changes to their organisation and assessment process. And a lot of readers of the Dash final report are highlighting this particular quote from a senior CQC executive that was interviewed. Changing team structure, changing IT, and introducing a new framework all at the same time was bonkers. Let's consider the provider portal first. Next slide, please. So initially, the CQC said that all of the providers' interactions with the CQC will be via the new provider portal, and that the portal would be easier than contacting them by phone or email. It was supposed to be faster, easier, and more streamlined, with pre-populated online forms, and enable providers to comment on CQC concerns in real time. As we know, the reality has been far different. The provider portal has not worked well. Users cannot easily upload documents. There are issues getting a password reset, and there are no auto responses to let you know if information has been uploaded properly. Now, these issues are causing providers and CQC staff distress and delaying publication of assessment reports. In terms of overcoming these issues, if you can, take a belt and braces approach and make submissions via the portal and by email. The CQC is currently working to fix the provider portal, so watch this space. Next slide, please. So this is quite a text-heavy slide. This is to explain the CQC's organisational changes. And I will say now that they have been criticised, again, by the reports. So as part of the single assessment framework, the CQC reorganised its operational teams. The table sets out the changes from the old regime to the new regime, and then recommendations for the future. Essentially, the CQC combined their specialist sector teams, so adult social care, hospitals and primary medical services, into one operations group. However, Sir Mike Richards recommends the CQC revert to separate sector teams. Inspection teams were previously divided into regions. They are now divided into regional networks, so London and East of England, Midlands, North and South, and have been divided further into local teams. As part of reorganisation, the CQC teams have been rearranged and new roles introduced. So the operations manager, previously inspection manager, now leads a team made up not only of inspectors, specialist advisors and experts by experience, but also assessors, regulatory coordinators and regulatory officers. Now, I will briefly touch upon regulatory coordinators and regulatory officer roles, and I'll do that before looking at assessor role. Now, the regulatory coordinators triage information and collect evidence, and regulatory officers plan inspections and support administrative duties. Now, assessors. We will not spend too long here because the assessor role has now been removed. I've highlighted it in red because it's a recommendation that has been fulfilled. The CQC basically divided up the inspector role into two, assessor and inspector, whereby the inspector visits the service and the assessor collects the evidence and writes the assessment report, having never visited the service. It was inevitable that providers found that there was a disconnect between what the inspector asked for when attending the service and the assessor's comments when receiving and reviewing evidence without the context of visiting the service. You will note that it has been recommended that the CQC reinstate the Deputy Chief Inspector roles. And this is largely down to numbers because previously each of the 4 regions had a Chief Inspector for each sector. Now each regional network has only 1 director. And then Chief Inspectors. Previously there were 3, 1 for each sector. Now there are 2. So Richards has actually recommended 4, 1 for adult social care, hospitals, primary medical services, and a 4th for mental health services. Whilst we're talking about CQC organisational changes, we should mention CQC's new Chief Executive, Sir Julian Hartley. Now, based on a recent HSJ podcast, I understand that he is an outspoken critic of the CQC's single word ratings, which is actually an Ofsted-style system brought in by Jeremy Hunt. And as you know, Ofsted has scrapped single word ratings. So again, watch this space. Next slide, please. So let's delve into the assessment process. It is important to consider the assessment process as a whole before delving into the detail of quality statements, evidence categories, and so on. So firstly, I want you to appreciate that there has been a shift in language. The CQC no longer focuses solely on inspections, but has replaced that word with assessments, of which inspections are a part. The CQC has been following this assessment process as shown on the slide. So in terms of step one, review, the CQC will review evidence to decide which provider to assess next. Now, assessments may be responsive, so following information of concern, which could include whistleblowing, notifications, and national data, or assessments may be planned or scheduled, which factor in when the CQC last inspected, the level of risk, and history of enforcement. Now, the frequency of inspections is a current hot topic. Initially, providers were concerned that ratings could be updated at any time, which they can, but without a need for a full inspection, resulting in them constantly being on their guard. In reality, many providers are still awaiting an assessment, stuck with a rating of requires improvement or inadequate. Delays in assessments has been criticised in the recent reports. In response to Dash's interim report, the CQC stated that it would release information on the frequency of assessments this August or September. And this was delayed, and the CQC then gave a timescale of as soon as possible. The timescale has not been updated since Dash's final report and Richard's first report, but the CQC hopes that the urgent review of the portal and IT systems will enable it to rapidly assess, rate, and publish reports. Step two, the CQC plan for assessments where inspectors decide which quality statements will be reviewed for that provider. And then step three, gathering evidence stage. Evidence is gathered on-site and off-site. On-site evidence gathering or inspections are still a key tool, but under the new regime, inspections will be more focused. And then step four, evidence is reviewed, resulting in a draft report with a draft rating. A draft rating is produced by scores being assigned to quality statements under key questions. Step five, from a CQC's perspective, the factual accuracy check is an opportunity for inspectors to have all relevant information to make their judgment. And then finally, step six, a final rating report is published on the CQC's website. It's no longer published in PDF format. It now is HTML embedded in the website, but a PDF version can be downloaded. Next slide, please. Before we consider the quality statements and evidence categories, let's note that the single assessment framework replaces 4 assessment frameworks. However, this in itself has been deemed as flawed, that one size does not fit all. You can also see that the 5 key questions remain. Is the service safe, caring, responsive, effective, and well-led? And it involves the CQC collecting evidence both on-site and off-site on an ongoing basis. What is new is the CQC having the power to update a service's rating at any time without an inspection, and the quality statements and evidence categories, which we will now consider. Next slide, please. The quality statements. So just a few points on the quality statements. The CLOE's prompts and ratings characteristics have been replaced by 34 quality statements, which focus on specific topics under the 5 key questions. So again, safe, caring, effective, responsive, and well-led. And when you look at each quality statement, you will see both we and I statements, as well as links to the regulations. So that's the Health and Social Care Act 2008, Regulated Activities Regulations 2014, and the Care Quality Commission Registration Regulations 2009, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. And the evidence categories sit under each quality statement. Next slide, please. Right, let's look at an example. So 6 of the 34 quality statements sit under the effective key question. The quality statements are listed on the slide, so assessing needs, delivering evidence-based care and treatment, etc. And the quality statement of assessing needs links to regulations 9 and 12. And when you look on the CQC's website, you will also see that providers are also advised to consider regulations 10, 11 and 17. Also, a lot of best practice guidance links are provided for each quality statement on the CQC's website. Next slide, please. Under each quality statement, there are both we and I statements. We statements show what is needed for a provider to deliver high quality person-centered care. So an example there, we maximise the effectiveness of people's care and treatment by assessing and reviewing their health, care, well-being and communication needs with them. I statement reflect what service users have said matters to them. Again, and you've got a few examples. I can get information and advice about my health, care and support and how I can be as well as possible physically, mentally and emotionally. Again, based on recent reports, there are calls to simplify the quality statements. These I and we statements have been described as off-putting. However, of the two, I statements are preferred. So who knows, we may see the removal of we statements. Next slide, please. Priority quality statements has been mentioned quite a bit. And these are a set of quality statements out of the 34 quality statements that will be considered in some sense of priority. This is to reflect a proactive rather than reactive approach to regulation, positively and continuously focusing on specific core areas across all services frequently and universally, as opposed to only jumping in when something goes wrong. Now, the CQC had said that priority quality statements will represent the minimum scope to a routine assessment over a period of 1 to 2 years. They wanted to cover all the quality statements for each service over a 2-year period. Next slide, please. I believe that we are still waiting for a CQC publication of the priority quality statements. In its absence, we have the following. In around March this year, it was identified that there were 5 quality statements that were given priority or assessed more often than not. And these are listed on the slide and include safeguarding, involving people to manage risks, and so on. Then in May this year, Ian Trenholm stated in his blog that when the CQC is carrying out an assessment of a service that is either inadequate or requires improvement, all quality statements under the key questions that are rated inadequate or requires improvement will be reviewed, so essentially given priority. Then the DASH report revealed that typically between 5 and 12 statements are being assessed, depending on the sector or subsector. However, Mike Richards questions the rationale for priority quality statements, saying that the system is unclear and confusing. Having said all that, I have come across a service that was inspected under all 34 quality statements, which was clearly very intensive. So, which actually means you have to prepare for all of them. Next slide, please. Moving on to evidence categories. The CQC is not prescriptive and therefore doesn't specify precisely what must be done in order to meet their quality statements. But there are now different categories of evidence that it will focus on when assessing a particular quality statement. There are 6 evidence categories, and the information obtained by the CQC under each of the 34 quality statements will be organised under these 6 evidence categories. However, as of the 3rd of October, the CQC stopped scoring evidence categories. Instead of scoring, the CQC will use its professional judgment. Both reports, so Dash and Richard, revealed the reason behind this shift. These include the use of evidence categories and scoring complicates and delays the production of reports. It does not allow for meaningful narrative. Stronger statements were also made. Evidence categories are a nonsense. In fact, Mike Richards calls for not only the suspension of scoring of evidence categories, but also for their removal. Next slide, please. Sticking with effective as an example, this illustrates how the evidence categories sit underneath the quality statements. Quality statements along the left, evidence categories across the top, and the X's indicate which evidence is collected by the CQC to assess each quality statement within the effective key question. Note that evidence in the form of people's experiences and feedback from staff and leaders is collected for the majority of the quality statements. This is the case for each key question, not just effective. Also note that outcomes as an evidence category is gathered only for one quality statement within the effective key question, and we will come back to this point in relation to outcomes. Next slide, please. This is an important slide. The title is a link to the CQC's website. It shows the sector groups. So these have been increasing over time. I gave this talk back in March, and there were 8 sector groups at the time. There are now 15. So when you use the link, it takes you to full PDF guides on the CQC's website covering evidence categories for your sector. I suggest that you download the relevant guide for your sector and take a thorough look. Next slide, please. So looking at feedback, the CQC has said the assessment framework places people's experience at the heart of CQC's judgments. If CQC receives feedback of poor care, it will review and gather more evidence, even if other evidence sources have not identified any issues. 3 of the evidence categories relate to feedback. So you know them: people's experience, feedback from staff and leaders, and feedback from partners. But that means that over 60% of the evidence that the CQC collect during an assessment is feedback evidence. And this is a marked difference from the old regime. Next slide, please. Here is a list of some of the ways in which the CQC will gather feedback evidence. Note, this list is non-exhaustive. You can start to get prepared and put in place systems for collecting and analysing this information. So some of these are CQC-led, such as give feedback on care forms, interviews and focus groups, but others are more provider-led, complaints, compliments, survey results. Tracy will go into this in more detail, but what I would say is take control of your processes, analyse and learn from your survey results and complaints, and make sure that you are logging the compliments your service and staff receive. Next slide, please. I'm not going to talk too much about outcomes, other than to say outcomes are focused on the impact of care processes on individuals. Some examples of outcome measures that the CQC could consider are listed on the slide. Also listed are where the CQC sourced the information from. As mentioned, outcomes as an evidence category is not used much by the CQC. It is used more for assessments of hospitals and not at all for adult social care. This lack of assessment of outcomes has been criticised, in particular against the intense amount of feedback evidence and the importance that has been applied to people's experiences. This imbalance was summed up by Mike Richards, who said, patients under the care of breast surgeon Ian Patterson and GP Harold Shipman initially reported good experiences of care, but had disastrous outcomes. Next slide, please. Right, scoring and rating. So brace yourselves because it is complex, as you know. The ratings of outstanding, good, requires improvement, and inadequate are staying the same. At least for now. Let's see what happens under the new chief executive. But what has changed is the CQC is using a scoring process to calculate ratings. Next slide, please. It was envisaged that scores would promote greater structure, transparency, and consistency in assessments. Evidence categories were given a score of 1 to 4. The CQC would combine evidence category scores to reach a quality statement score. Then in turn, they would then turn the quality statement score into a percentage, then back into a score using the percentage thresholds that you can see on the slide. And the CQC then uses the quality statement scores to update the key question score. The key question scores produce a key question rating, again, using percentage thresholds, and then finally produce an overall rating. Now, as I said, it is quite complex. You will receive these slides to be able to follow through, but let's look at an example. Next slide, please. So this is how it worked before evidence category scores were scrapped. Evidence categories were given a score for each quality statement within a key question. And this is an example of caring, the caring key question, which has 5 quality statements. Remember, this part of the process has been scrapped. The CQC will no longer score evidence categories and will now apply their professional judgment instead. And it is unclear how the scoring system will be changed to account for the fact that evidence categories will no longer be scored. The CQC has not released further information. As of yesterday, its website still refers to evidence categories being scored. Next slide, please. So moving on, this shows how the CQC arrives at a quality statement score. So each quality statement for the caring key question, kindness, compassion and dignity, treating people as individuals, etc., will have a total score calculated by dividing the total by the maximum possible total score for the quality statement. You then turn the score into a percentage, then back into a score using the thresholds, as I mentioned. Next slide, please. This is an example of a key question score being produced. Sticking with the caring key question, collating the quality statement scores to give a total score. The CQC calculate a percentage score by dividing the total, in this case 14, by the maximum possible total score, so 20. And here then the percentage score is 70%, and then using your thresholds, this key question falls within the 63% and 87% threshold, so the caring key question is rated good. Next slide, please. The usual overall rating aggregate applies, as you can see on the slide. However, there are rating limiters, which I'll run through. Next slide, please. So rating limiters are, if the key question score is within the good range, but there is a score of 1 for one or more quality statement scores, the rating is limited to requires improvement. And also, if the key question score is within the outstanding range, but there is a score of 1 or 2 for one or more quality statement scores, the rating is limited to good. Next slide, please. The title on this page, again, is a link to the CQC's website, so to their rating principles. I will not go through each one, but highlight the principle in red, which is widely used by the CQC. If 2 or more of the key questions are rated as requires improvement, then the overall rating will normally be requires improvement. Next slide, please. So in this part, I'm going to talk about providers needing more information on how to obtain a particular rating. I will cover inspecting for good, so what outstanding, good, requires improvement and inadequate tends to look like. Also touch upon the talks of a new regulatory handbook and the system of converting old ratings into current scores. Next slide, please. So the CQC has not provided detailed guidance on what constitutes outstanding, good, etc. for each quality statement. The CQC had said originally that it wants to move away from lengthy checklists that were those that were in the CLOEs. With not much to go on at present, here are some key identifiers. These were revealed in a CQC webinar earlier this year. So the quality statements themselves are pinned at good level. If you are doing everything set out in the quality statements, you are at good level. Outstanding is a level above. So terms like creative, innovative, going the extra mile, good levels of person-centered care apply. Requires improvement means that you are sometimes doing what is set out in the quality statement. So you're only doing it sometimes. You're not always doing it. You're not doing it at all, but you're doing it sometimes. You are inconsistent, and there are possible regulation breaches. Inadequate means the level of care set out in the quality statements are not being delivered, and there are regulation breaches. Do note that one of the issues with the single assessment framework that has been identified is that for some providers, the scoring system would give a good rating, even though there were multiple breaches of regulation. Next slide, please. Whilst the CQC intended to move away from lengthy checklists that were in the CLOEs, the CQC has begun work on a new regulatory handbook, which will include what good looks like for each sector, again, spurred by the DASH report. It is understood that this handbook will include ratings characteristics. Now, the CQC is asking for your views on the handbook and what it should include. The CQC and Care Provider Alliance have run surveys on the regulatory handbook and the single assessment framework, respectively. And I heard last week that the CQC are running test and learn pilots. So keep a watch out. Don't miss out on your opportunity to have your voice heard and to help shape this new handbook. It is vital that the CQC hears from a variety of providers in each sector. Next slide, please. As mentioned, assessments that took place at the start of the year saw services being re-rated when only 5 or around 5 of the 34 quality statements had been assessed. That means the remaining quality statements were scored using previous findings in past inspections. For quality statements not being assessed, a score will be allocated between 1 and 4, so where 1 is inadequate and 4 is outstanding. And that's based on the previous rating for that particular key question. Now, Ian Trenholm, the previous chief executive of the CQC, had assured the sector that if the CQC assesses a particular quality statement, it will collect new evidence under every relevant evidence category for that quality statement. So this means that each quality statement that is assessed will not be assessed based on a combination of old and new evidence. However, it remains that a key question, so safe, well-led, etc., could be made up of scores derived from previous key question ratings. Now, in these recent reviews, the process has been described as, I quote, not credible, inappropriate, unfair to providers, does not make sense, gives an unreliable picture of current quality and safety, can make it impossible to upgrade even where there has been improvement. So it looks like this is something that the CQC may need to stop doing. I say that, but the CQC has been doing this for years before the single assessment framework. Now they have been more transparent about the process and have attracted criticism. Next slide, please. I will briefly touch upon challenging an assessment. You can challenge an assessment in a number of ways through factual accuracy comments, rating reviews, challenging enforcement action by making representations, appealing to the first tier tribunal, or defending criminal enforcement action. You can also complain to the CQC or at the highest level, issue judicial review proceedings. Now, this is a topic for an entirely separate webinar, but I will say that these processes are largely unchanged under the single assessment framework. The difference now really is information being uploaded to the portal. Most importantly, do not miss out on your opportunity to challenge at factual accuracy stage, because failing to do so is accepting inaccuracies as the truth. And VWV can assist with each one of these on the slide. Next slide, please. So before I hand over to Tracy, this slide is a recap of what we've discussed. So we've covered changes, quality statements, evidence categories, scoring and rating, what we know about what good looks like, and also briefly challenging assessments. Thanks a lot for listening. I will take questions in the Q&A session at the end. I will now hand over to Tracy.
Thank you, Gemma. Thank you very much. That was excellent, very, very informative. Could we go to my next slide, please? So yes, bringing up enforcement action. That's one of the key areas that I have worked with Gemma on. So we were working with one provider that had a notice of proposal, then consequently a notice of decision, and was just a few days away from tribunal when we managed to turn the service around. And that service now is still going. They've got 3 of the 5 evidence categories in good, so we're just waiting for an inspection to turn the other 2, hopefully, into good. So yes. So next slide, please. What we're going to be looking at in terms of my presentation. Sorry, I just need to move to the next slide myself. Bear with me. So we're going to be looking at how to effectively gather feedback from people using the services. We're going to look at what does an effective pathway of evidence look like? How can providers quality assure their own systems and processes? And should you be marking your own homework? And governance strategies to assure the Commission service compliance and good governance. So as Gemma said, to get that consistency within the service, to ensure that you can be rated a good service. Next slide, please. So Gemma's already covered these, and as she quite rightly said, 3 of the 5 evidence categories are around feedback, which is where I'm going to be focusing today. Could say that processes could include part of the feedback of systems and processes, which is where I find quite a lot of non-compliance when I'm visiting services to do a compliance assessment, mock inspection, if you want to call it that. So it's really, really, really important that you try and be proactive when it comes to gathering feedback from people that are using the service, from partners, from leaders, from all stakeholders as much as reasonably possible. Next slide, please. So these are some of the common themes that I've found as an independent consultant. I travel up and down the country in all different local authorities, working with all different types of providers. And these are the common themes that I see when it comes to feedback surveys. Surveys are conducted annually as standard still. And I would highly recommend that you, up your game when it comes to carrying out feedback surveys and do them more than just annually. Make sure they're not just a tick box, obviously. Documents that are used are almost always electronic. There are some feedback surveys that are on paper, but what I would urge you to try and consider is the accessible information standard. So how are you, especially for example in a domiciliary care service, how are you gathering feedback via an electronic link from people that maybe do not have access to a laptop? And there are some things to consider, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Links are sent to families and friends, which is good, but don't replace families and friends with the people that are using your service. Make sure you're gathering that vital feedback on their experience. Questions are often complicated. So I'll give you an example of that, I think, in the next slide. Responses are often difficult to analyse, so providers are not making it easy for themselves to analyse the responses. An analysis is not always in place, so often I'll be handed a folder when I ask for feedback surveys or evidence of feedback from people that are using services, and I will be handed a folder that's absolutely full to the brim of feedback surveys with no analysis in place. And if there is an analysis, there's no action planning around the analysis. If there is action planning, there's no service improvement planning in place. So make sure you have a service improvement plan and you're regularly updating your service improvement plan. And feedback to those using services or those who participate is not always visible. So it might be people that are coming into the service, for example, a residential home or a nursing home. If you have healthcare professionals or chiropodists, hairdressers, people that pop into the service, make sure you're getting feedback from them. Next slide, please. So when we're looking at feedback, just bear with me a second. My slide has gone a bit crazy. We're looking for feedback from the person with support needs. We're looking feedback from families, from unpaid carers, so people that maybe come into the service or people that you're supporting in domiciliary care, advocates, community groups and teams that come into the service or that you have contact with, third sector groups, don't forget your Age UK or your volunteers, local authority, get feedback from your own local authority, and other healthcare professionals. So there are various ways to get feedback. You can obviously use face-to-face, verbal feedback, feedback surveys, as Gemma quoted. Also, don't forget Health Watch. HealthWatch is a great platform. If you're not registered with HealthWatch, make sure you are registered with HealthWatch. It's a great way for CQC to do some of their investigations before they come and visit your service or before they advertise, before they assess your service. And don't forget CQC's own Give Feedback on Care links. Make sure that you advertise that around your service or in your newsletters. You could get feedback from emails, telephone calls, focus groups, as Gemma said, and make sure you're reviewing your own data when gathering feedback and the systems and the processes that you're using. Complaints and compliments pathways, and obviously incident pathways when you're doing a deep dive into incidents and you're trying to analyze what went well during that incident and what may be needed to improve. Have the discussions with the people that have been involved in the incidents. Have a discussion with the local authority if you're involved in a Section 42. How well did we manage that? What could we have done better? And interview groups and leads, the focus groups that Gemma was kind of talking about. Next slide, please. So when gathering data, please try and remember people who may be fearful or traumatized. So you may be trying to carry out feedback surveys on somebody who's just had a major trauma in their life or have lost somebody. Make sure you're thinking about people whose first language is not English. Are you able to translate any of your feedback surveys at all? Think about people that face communication barriers due to a disability or a sensory impairment. And think about people that are digitally excluded. And also people that believe they may not be academic enough to follow your link. Make sure that you're giving them the support that they need. And I would very much say, think about your activity coordinators. Could they maybe have some one-to-one time with some of the residents or the clients that you have within your service? When I inspect services or carry out compliance assessments, I will ask the providers, do you have anybody that has a cognitive loss or a sensory loss or a disability where they may not be able to follow your link? And often that is the quote that I hear most of the time. We don't have anyone here who needs information adapted in that way. Most of the time they'll tell me they asked. Is there any evidence that they asked? No, there isn't. So make sure if you are asking people if they want information adapted in a certain way, then please make sure that you record that you've asked them that question. There'll be sections within your care planning where you'll be able to do that. Next slide, please. So some practical and helpful hints, I hope, hints and tips. Get my teeth in today. Make sure that you are open and honest with your questioning. I will often ask people for their feedback surveys that have been completed with the help of a carer, so therefore they've not been able to be anonymous. If I ring that same client to gain some feedback on the service, I'll often hear a very different story. So make sure that you are encouraging people to be open and honest with the questioning, however brutal that may be. Scoring on answering system sometimes makes information difficult to gather, so make it easy for yourself. Use a 5-star, use a 1 to 5, use a 1 to 10 approach, makes it much easier. If you just have the open texts where people can freely write things themselves, it's very difficult to get that data together and provide an action plan around that. Make sure you're providing feedback surveys in several formats. Explain to people why feedback is important, especially staff and for people that visit your service. Use meetings as an opportunity to promote engagement. So that's resident meetings, that's care review meetings, that's multidisciplinary team meetings. Have those quality conversations and have some documentation around that to record them on. So a simple quality document would have the name, the provider's name, the resident's name or the client's name, the date, and just a box for you to record the conversation that you had. Have a simple quality statement document, like I said, but also align your feedback as much as you possibly can to not only the we statements and the I statements. Make CQC's life very easy when they come and inspect you or they assess you from afar. Think about the I statements and we statements. Don't just copy and paste them into a questionnaire, but adapt them around your own service values and mission statement and visions. Next slide, please. So what happens next? Plan and gather the data. Make sure you collate the data. Designate a person to analyze the data. Evaluate and agree an action plan. Add any future actions to your service improvement plan. Communicate the results from feedback surveys to staff and residents. You can do this with a you said, we did approach. Make sure that they're on notice boards and in larger print so they can be read. And make sure you use feedback, which may not be as favourable, as an opportunity to focus on actions to improve the service, to improve support, to improve needs, especially around incidents and accidents and complaints pathways, which we're going to look at very quickly next. If feedback is anonymous and unfavourable, focus data gathering specific to the issue for additional improvements. Don't just push it to the side. And often what I will hear from managers is, you know, the feedback here wasn't very good, but they didn't leave their name or their number, so we can't really do anything about it. Well, that's not strictly true. Take the feedback and run with it yourself. Next slide, please. So I'm trying desperately to run to time here. So we're going to look at a pathway example here very quickly. I'm going to use a complaints pathway. So I think some of you looking at this slide will probably recognize the head in the sand approach or the running away from the phone approach. Often the way that providers feel when they first get a complaint that comes into the service, it's often, oh no, we've got a complaint. And I try and get providers to think about complaints as an opportunity to demonstrate to people how well you deal with complaints as a service and what a good service you are, especially if it's a complaint that's gone directly to CQC. Demonstrate to CQC how you manage complaints well. Next slide, please. So these are just some hints and tips, a little bit of fun, really. Breathe, calm. Don't have an immediate keyboard warrior response. Yeah, I think you might have to click through these, Jen. Follow your suggestions and your own suggestions and complaints policy. Make sure you have that in mind. Have it with you when you start with a complaint. Stay focused on the facts in the complaint. Objective and not subjective language. Use your own complaints documentation. If you don't use the documentation that's on your policy, update your policy with the documentation you do use. Acknowledge receipt of a complaint via an email, and don't be defensive with any of your replies. So for example, this is something where my complaints pathway of evidence will start when I go into a service. I will first of all look at the complaint, and then I will look at how quickly did the provider acknowledge the complaint. When you're writing emails, write the email, read it, reread it, have a break, read it, reread it, then send, is my advice to you. Next slide, please. So, what to do next? Investigate your complaint. Make sure that you are documenting everything that you are, all of the information that you are gathering. And what I would really say is I often go into providers where the investigation documents would sit on one platform, the complaint will sit on another platform, the CQC notification will sit on another platform, the duty of candor letter that was sent out would be somewhere else. Try and gather all of your data together. One of the things that I will say to provider when they say, well, I have that in an email, and then I'll ask them for the email and they can't find it. So you imagine if you maybe have an inspection 4 years down the line after a major complaint, are you actually going to be able to find that email? Would it be better to PDF it and save it all together? Consider the actions that you wish to take and write the actions down. Consider if it reaches criteria for a CQC notification or to notify your local authority under your specific contract or tender contract you may have with your local authority. Record the outcome of the complaint on a tracker or a log. Feedback to the complainant. Record the improvement on your service improvement plan. So we're looking at that pathway of evidence. Consider a root cause analysis if you're still calling it a root cause analysis, and any lessons learned. So when I go into a service, what I will be looking at is the initial complaint. I'll be looking at how quickly the provider responded. Did they respond to the complaint as per their own policy and procedure and use the appropriate documentation? What are the actions? So often I will see a list of actions, one of which will be for all of the staff to retake their medication training. So I will then look at the tracker to see if all of the staff did indeed retake their medication training. So make sure that any actions that you are recording are actually followed through. If you can, if at all possible, have a sign-off section in the action plan. Next slide, please. So I think I've probably covered quite a lot of this in the slide before, but resources are always a problem. So you can delegate tasks to senior teams. Have an inspection approach when you're collecting the data. So consider yourself as an inspector. What would an inspector see if they were looking at the pathways of evidence that you have in front of you? Is there anything missing? You may think to yourself, oh, I can get that from Sarah, or I can get that from Jessica when the inspector comes. But get that data now, pull it together and have it all in one place. So I think we'll be sharing the slides at the end of the session, but make sure that your service improvement plan is up to date. Ask people that are using the service. Put yourself in the position of the lived experience. So that's people's feelings, people's understanding, people's needs, people's wishes. Seek external perspective if around compliance. So if you want to, there's plenty of consultants out there that will come and do a mock inspection or a compliance audit. I'm one of them, but there are lots of other consultants out there if you want to hire a consultant to do that. And work with quality monitoring teams. So I always say to my providers who often think maybe their ratings were, not very favorable for one reason or another, I'll always say to them, you get more with honey than you do with vinegar. So work with the CQC inspectors, work with the quality monitoring teams, and carry out your own mock inspection. Next slide, please. So you've got audits, audit your files and your tools and your systems. So carry out your own complaints audit or incident audit. Make sure all of those things that I've spoken about before, your action planning, your outcomes, your lessons learned, make sure your lessons learned are visible. Lessons learned don't always have to be something negative, i.e. we must have. Lessons learned can often be something positive. For example, a lesson learned in this situation is how quick we were to respond to this issue, how well our teams work together, etc. Gather themes and trends around complaints at least quarterly, and feedback to residents and stakeholders, themes and trends and service improvements that you have planned. Effectively communicate to people, what is it that are the themes and trends around your accidents, your incidents, your safeguarding concerns, your compliments. Make sure that you share the themes and trends around compliments, and make sure you share themes and trends around complaints. Be honest, even the themes and the trends around complaints may even be you. Next slide, please. So to ensure, as Gemma says, it's really important to make sure that you are inspection ready with all of the changes that are happening with CQC at the moment. It's really important. So these are just some of the hints and tips that I would say to ensure that your pathways are solid, ready for CQC. Complete a case study of any events that have happened in your service. Complete some reflective practice. Root cause analysis. Use complaints as part of feedback from services. especially good if you're working with local authority teams, to think about what went well and what didn't go well. And use complaint case studies as part of your induction trainings, or incidents as part of your induction training, or safeguardings. Make safeguarding real. Take an actual incident, anonymize it, and use it as part of your induction. Following their e-learning, you could have a session where you debrief following e-learning and say, what would you do in this situation? So just looking at this slide, for me, I can see at least 4 of the quality statements that you would need to provide evidence for if indeed you did all of these well. Learning improvements and innovation would be part of your reflective practice. Governance, management, and sustainability would be part of your root cause analysis. Freedom to speak up, welcoming complaints and actively seeking feedback and acting on grumbles or informal complaints, if you would like to call them that. And listening and involving people. So use feedback to inform service improvements, and feedback to your residents or your clients are the improvements that you have planned and when they're planned, and keep them regularly up to date with those. So I think, speaking at 100 miles an hour, I might have kept us to time. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I'd like to say thank you very much for listening to myself and to Gemma, and I think we hand over to somebody to take any questions.
Thanks, Tracy. That was really, really great. Some really good hints and tips there. So we've got 1 minute to go, and it's not a bad thing because we've got 2 questions to answer. So one is in the chat and one is in the Q&A. So what I'll do is I'll read the one in the chat. So that question is, how does the single assessment framework promote transparency and accountability in care provision? And I'd say I'm not too sure it really does promote transparency and accountability. Probably the one way in which it does is the feedback element. But what you need then is for the CQC to corroborate that information that they receive through feedback. And that's really then how they can get true transparency and accountability of the care that you're providing as a service to your patients or service users, because obviously what a service user says versus reality, it needs to be tested, and I don't think enough of that is being done by inspectors. So I think really just think about how feedback fits into all of that, and using the single assessment framework and those PDFs that I had highlighted for you to be able to trace ways in which you can evidence high quality care provision in accordance with the regulations. So I'd say that's probably the best way. Tracy, there's another question. We're just 1 minute past 2, and that's in the Q&A. And that's to do with, I'll read it out and we can try and answer. So London-wide LMCs, CQC have told us that the different quality statements will carry the same weighting under the single assessment framework, but we see them mark GP practices down disproportionately for a low score on the patient satisfaction Ipsos Mori survey, low childhood IMS rates and low cervical screening rates. Can you please confirm whether these areas are more heavily weighted than others? Shall I answer, Tracy?
Yes.
Yeah, so I mean, again, it comes down to the way in which this single assessment framework has been put together. This information is probably deemed as feedback, and that's heavily weighted in terms of the evidence categories. The CQC have said the evidence categories are equally weighted, but at the same time, you know, the table that I showed you in terms of the evidence categories for the quality statements under each key question, they're collecting more feedback rather than all the other areas. So you're going to have the CQC consider these over and above certain other areas like observations and processes. So again, use those PDF documents, go onto the CQC's website, you will receive the slides and it's got the link. And then you can kind of get a true understanding as to what you need to show for each of the quality statements. But I think simply because of that disproportionate use of feedback, I'm not saying feedback's not important, but it's heavily weighted on that. And I think that's where this falls in. So
Yeah.
I won't keep you any longer because we're 2 minutes past. Thank you very much for joining Tracy and I. It's been a very good session, I would say. I hope you have found it helpful and some useful tips to take away. You've got our contact details there. So if you do have any queries, do not hesitate to contact either Tracy or myself. And you will have had a poll as well, which hopefully you've filled in. So we look forward to seeing you again at another future webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.